Howdy y'all, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about Fort Union in New Mexico. Fort Union was built in 1851 and it was under service, or it was used by the government or the army until roughly 1891. And it has a very interesting history where they say there was basically three different Fort Unions on this area, or three different renditions of this fort. And this Fort Union in New Mexico is not to be confused with Fort Union Trading Post in North Dakota. This trading post in North Dakota was very famous for its fur trade. However, we're going to be focusing today on the Fort Union of New Mexico. And I believe the New Mexican Fort Union is a little more interesting and a little more important, especially when you look at its history of being a star fort. But I'm going to begin at the beginning, at least according to what the current narrative says, and that is in 1851 when General Sumner basically is traveling the Santa Fe Trail. And when he gets to the Santa Fe area, it says that he finds that his troops are engaging in debauchery. And this angers him, and it makes him want to create basically a station for his troops that is a little far away from the major city and the major trail. So this is the reason they give that the original Fort Union was created. And now the first fort was more or less just a group of storage buildings and housing for the troops. There wasn't much of a defensive nature to it, but it was known as a defensive fort simply because it was housing all of these troops. Now, another interesting aspect about this is they say that when they built this first Fort Union, it was built under the order of this general and under the order of the government. However, it was built on the Mora people's land, or indigenous people's land, in what is now Mora County, New Mexico. So I found that to be very interesting. They say that there was a battle, not an actual physical battle, but a legal battle for this land throughout time from this Mora people, who basically said that they owned this land and the structures that were on it. However, nothing really ever came of that, and of course the government paid off these people, and now it's a historical site. But it's just interesting to note that there was this sort of argument between the indigenous people, or the original people of this area, and the troops that came to build this original fort. Now, according to the current narrative, the Civil War rolls around in the 1860s, and at this point, the American generals decide that they need to make Fort Union a more defensive sort of fort. So, according to the current narrative, this is when the Star Fort in Fort Union was created. And they say this was created in a very quick amount of time, and this became one of the most well-known forts in the West during the Civil War. So if you ever got stationed or you had to go west and you were a troop, you would basically come to this Fort Union in New Mexico, this massive star fort. However, interestingly, they also say the reason that the second, or the star fort of Fort Union, was destroyed was because it was not big enough, and because the troops basically refused to be housed underground, and they did not like the dank setting of being in this star fort. So I thought that was very interesting, very funny. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. You're talking about soldiers that are fighting for their lives, and at the same time, they're unwilling to be basically in a more defensive structure that is underground, a star fort. But this is the reason they give that the third Pueblo style fort was constructed. And they don't say it in the narrative, but just assuming, as we look at these pictures, you can see that the second rendition, the Star Fort of Fort Union, was torn down. So I assume a lot of those stones and possibly some of those bricks and other things were reused when they built this third rendition of Fort Union. The third rendition, like I said, is a Pueblo style, completely above ground fort. And you can see some of the brickwork here is very rough, and other brickwork on these buildings is very fine, almost like the bricks themselves were made in a factory, like they were crafted. So it's interesting. They just put up these brick structures, and you can imagine how large they were when they stood and how amazing this building would have looked when it was completed. But you can also see it had a lot of amenities. It appears to have some sort of water or irrigation system, as well as different furnaces and things like that, and just very intricate for the time. So it makes me wonder how much of this came from the second Star Fort and how much of this was original, and how much of this, if any, came from the original first rendition of Fort Union, which no one really seems to talk about at all anymore. You can see this is a vast area that this fort took up at the time, and there was different amenities. Like I said before, it had its own original sundial that they say dates back to the 1860s, and just a lot more interesting aspects. There's not really any known photographs of the Star Fort when it was still standing as a full erected fort. Basically, you can see the Star Fort in aerial photographs, and you can see different pictures like that, but none remain of how it looked in its glory during the Civil War. And I just think it's really interesting that they built this Star Fort and it was not destroyed in the war, but rather it was torn down because the troops basically did not like it. So just an interesting narrative, one that I never heard before, especially when given to a Star Fort and a reason for it being torn down. And overall, this area from the first fort to even the third Pueblo rendition of the fort are very interesting and very beautiful images, and I just wanted to share them with you. I think with the current narrative that we're given, we can make the argument at least to ponder over which one of these forts and which rendition of it actually came first, and if the Star Fort may have been the oldest version of Fort Union. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments down below. Anything in this video that sparked your interest, let me know. And if you have any ideas about what was going on at this time, I'd love to hear those too. So I look forward to speaking with you, and I will see you on the next video.